So, Shalom Aleichem. Our topic today is, in Hebrew, the title is Purim Hazon v'Te'uzah lehadesh b'Torah. And in English, the Purim paradigm, the vision and daring to innovate. We have to be aware that in the world of Torah, there are always two points of view. There are obviously more than just two, but there are two essential leanings, schools of thought. This is true of today, and this is true of 10 years ago, and this is true of 2,000 and even 2,500 years ago. The events of Purim took place approximately 2,400 years ago, so we believe. And at that time, as today, we had amongst the Chachamim in Am Yisrael, and one assumes also amongst the common man on the street, there were two opinions, two positions regarding the question whether we should institute a new Chag, a new holiday in the Jewish calendar called Purim. Today, it's obvious to us, it's self-evident that Purim is part of the Jewish calendar, because it's been that way for 2,400 years, but it was not always that way. 2,400 years ago, there was a very big debate amongst the Jewish people, amongst the Chachamim, whether the very idea of instituting a new Chag in the Jewish calendar on a fixed basis every year, whether such a concept is at all feasible and plausible and correct. And we find many references to this discussion, to this debate, in Chazal themselves. Chazal are not trying to hide this fact from us. In fact, they do everything almost in their power to tell us that this is what was going on. And that itself is an important point, because it could have worked out differently. It could be that in the Talmudim, in the Midrashim before us, we would not find sources that tell us explicitly that there was such a debate, there was such a mahloket, and there was quite a bit of strife and tension over this issue. It didn't have to be recorded. We could have found Masechet Megillah in the Mishnah, in the Gemara, and learnt it without ever hearing such a thing, if that's what Chazal wanted us to know. They could have censored it out. They could have just not mentioned it. And that's what many people today do nowadays, by the way. Today, and not just today, in previous generations as well, many people censor different things in the Torah, simply remove them from the text, remove them from the books. If it doesn't fit in with their world view, with their hashkafat olam, they delete it, they expunge it. Certainly not with regards to this issue. So let's begin looking at some of the sources. The first source on the source sheet before you is from the Talmud Bavli Masechet Megillah Daf Zayin. It says here, first of all, Amar Rav Shmuel Bar Yehuda bat Tehila keva'ua b'Shushan ulevasof b'chol ha'olam kulo. That's just by way of introduction. The first thing he says, this Chacham, Rav Shmuel Bar Yehuda, the first thing he says is that Purim didn't happen in an instant like that. It just didn't take off and was accepted overnight by everybody. Initially, my guess is, he doesn't say this explicitly, but my guess is that he means probably for a number of years. Purim was celebrated in Shushan, which was the capital of the Persian Empire, which was the scene of the events, or the center, the focal point of all these events that led to what we call Purim, as recorded in the Megillah. And after a period of time, it was accepted in the wider Jewish world. And this is already a hint that it wasn't the going was not smooth. It wasn't such a simple matter to get the concept of Purim accepted by everybody. And then he goes on to say more explicitly, the same Chacham, Rav Shmuel Bar Yehuda, goes on to say on the same daf, that's Oth Beth, the next source, He says as follows, Shalha lahem Esther lahachamim. Esther, who was the queen, as we know, of the Persian Empire, and she was also one of the very, very major figures in the events of Purim, she sent a letter to the Chachamim. Apparently this is a reference to the Chachamim who were in Eretz Yisrael at that time. Probably what we would refer to as Anshe Knesset HaGadolah. And her request was, in her letter, Kiva'uni ledoroth. Rashi explains, what does that mean, Kiva'uni ledoroth, which literally means, establish me for all time. Rashi says, Kiva'uni liyom tov ulikriya. In other words, she requested, maybe one could also say, demanded the Chachamim enact a new Chag called Purim, which would involve the Chovah to make this a special day, Yom Tov, and some people understand the term Yom Tov here to mean even a day when it's asur to do melacha, but certainly a special day, and Kriyah, that is a Chovah to read the Megillah. That was her request, and you would think it's not such an unreasonable request, especially if you don't imagine that she was asking for a Yom Tov in the sense of not doing melacha like a real Yom Tov. Then what's she asking after all? She's asking that what we do nowadays, that we read the Megillah and we have a good time, we throw a party, we have a nice Seudah. Why would that be a problem? What did the Chachamim respond? According to the Gemara, Kina'a ath me'oreret aleno leven ha'umuth. Literally, you are going to cause us trouble with the Goyim. Very simple response, and I imagine that's a response that you've heard before. You've heard that somewhere before. You can imagine many rabbis today, and 10 years ago, and 30 years ago, and 50 years ago, saying exactly the same thing. Seeing that we're in this particular yeshiva, I will mention briefly that when Rav Meir Kahana Zatzal began his campaign for Soviet Jewry, in, I think it was perhaps 69 when it began, but certainly the early 70s, there were a number of Rabbanim who went on record. I'm not going to mention their names now, but there were a number of Rabbanim, usually one would describe them as being of a Haredi persuasion, but not, I think, all of them, in America, who came out and said that A, it's not going to work, and B, it's going to cause anti-Semitism, and it's going to boomerang against us, it's going to cause all of us Jews here in Chutz La'aretz, and maybe in Israel as well, it's going to cause us all a lot of trouble. In fact, what happened was exactly the opposite. But so much for predictions, and so much for people who think they understand the way the world works, as opposed to people who actually do know how the world works. So this kind of response, you're going to cause us trouble with the Goyim, keep things quiet, don't rock the boat, shouldn't be such a surprise to you. And this is what the Gemara tells us, that the Chachamim, or at least many Chachamim, responded to Esther. And she responded to them, Shalha lahem, Kvar kethuva ani al divrei hayamim lemalche madai ufaras. If you're trying to keep this whole business of Purim and what happened here in Shushan and the rest of the empire, that we, the Jews, were given permission by Amelech Ahashverosh to rise up and strike against and kill our enemies, wherever they may be, they and their families, as it says Mefurash in the Megillah, if you're trying to keep that quiet so that people, the Goyim, don't know about it, well, you can't, because it's already written in the history books. It's written in the archives of the empire, of the royal household, of the royal historians have all noted this, and everyone is aware of this. It can't be kept a secret. And to this we see no reply in the Gemara. There's no reply to this response of Esther. So it seems there was a good argument, it was a good response. What we call in Hebrew, in halachic discourse, kushya she'en alea teshuvah. All right, so that's number one. We see that there was, according to this source that we just saw now, that we just read, there was a reluctance, at least on part of many of the Chachamim, to institute a new Chag. Why? Concern about what the Goyim will make of it, how they will deal with it, how they will relate to this idea of the Jews celebrating the fact that they killed so many non-Jews. By the way, does anyone know? Anyone take note? How many non-Jews rather, enemies of the Jewish people, were killed in the 2-3 days?
7,811.
exactly. Well, I think it's 810 actually, but maybe, okay, well, we can argue about the 11, but it's 75,810 or 811, and that's a lot of people. The Israeli army has not killed that many people in all the wars and all the battles and all the mivtzaim that it has performed over the years. We haven't killed that many people. That's a very large number of people, so you can understand why it made waves. It must have made waves in the empire. There were all these people who saw what the Jews were allowed to do, and they got away with it, and now they're celebrating. You can understand if you wish to be honest, where these chachamim were coming from. In the third source, number 1, Gimel, Shalha lahem Esther chachamim. This is also in the Talmud Bavli. This is another request, another statement. Kitvuni ledoroth, which means the book recording the events of Purim, in other words, the Megillah, I want it made part of the Tanakh, part of Kitvei HaKodesh. And this request also was not received very positively by at least many of the Chachamim. They quoted to her in response a pasuk from Mishlei, which reads, pasuk Perek Kaf Bet, pasuk Kaf, Shalchu la halo chatavti lecha shalishim b'mu'isoth wada'ath. Shalishim v'lo rib'im. This pasuk, which is according to the Pshat not discussing Amalek, nothing to do with Amalek, was seen as being, it was interpreted in such a way that it had some connection to the miswa of Mehiyat Amalek, of wiping out Amalek, and Haman and Purim has everything to do with Amalek. And they said this pasuk talks about there being 3 places in the Tanakh where it's mentioned, not 4 places. The 3 places that's already mentioned are in Sefer Shemoth, where Am Yisrael runs into Amalek for the first time. Later in Sefer Devarim it's mentioned, and then in Sefer Shemuel with Shaul, who's told to go and wipe out Amalek. So they explain that we don't think it needs to be said again. It's been said 3 times, it appears 3 times, that's enough. However, it goes on to say, Ad Shema Sa'ulo Mikra, Kathu B'Torah. But eventually, and from here you can read between the lines, and we'll see in a moment when we get to the next few sources that we're reading, not so much reading between the lines, but actually reading the information correctly. To read between the lines here, I mean to say that you understand that there were those Chachamim who did not agree with that original response. They thought that it's a good idea. They were on Esther's side, but not all Chachamim were, but some were. And some of them quoted the following pasuk, Chetov Zoth Zikaron Basefer. This is a pasuk in Sefer Shemot, the end of Parashat Beshalach, talking about Amalek. And they were Doresh, the pasuk, Kethov Zoth, Masha Katuv Kan, Uva Mishne Torah, that refers to Zoth, because that refers to the Torah, like Zoth HaTorah, Asher Sam Moshe Lifnei Bnei Yisrael. Zikaron, Masha Katuv B'Nevi'im, Basefer, Masha Katuv B'Megillah. In other words, in opposition to the original response and the original drasha, another drasha was offered, which made it possible and made it reasonable to say we can and should add this 4th mention, this 4th instance of Mehiyat Amalek and make it part of the Tanakh. In other words, the Megillah. So let's sum up for a moment what we just saw here. The Talmud Bavli tells us quite unequivocally. It's not trying to hide anything. It's in fact coming to tell us something. It's coming to tell us that instituting a new Chag, or making a new book in the Tanakh, or making a new holiday, these ideas do not go over so simply amongst the Jewish people, amongst the Chachamim. There will always be opposition, because there will always be these 2 approaches. Those who are more conservative, those who hold by the pasuk, Mashe haya hu she'yeh, those who think that which was is what should always be, and those who are more open to the idea of something which is visionary, something new, in response to a new reality, to a new situation. They don't necessarily disqualify something which is new, something which hasn't been done before. These 2 positions you will always find these 2 positions within the Chachamim, amongst the Chachamim, in their discussions on different issues, as we will mention later. So here the Talmud Bavli is telling us there were such there was definitely a body of opinion that was opposed to these requests, these suggestions, these demands perhaps of Esther. And apparently, and here I'm reading between the lines at least at this point, there were those who agreed, and eventually they gained the upper hand. But how this happened, we'll see from the following sources. Now let's look at the next source, number 2. These are psukim from Sefer Esther. The first paragraph begins, the ones that are quoted here before you, وَيِخْتَوْ مَرْدَخَي أَثَ دَوَرِيمْ هَيْلَ. That Mordechai wrote these things down. And Rashi, you'll see Rashi below the second paragraph. Rashi says, "Vayichtov Mordechai, hi ha-megillah hazov kemoth shehi." In other words, Rashi is telling you the megillah that we have was written by Mordechai, and he related the events of Purim, everything that led up to Purim, and how things panned out in the end, and the end result of everything. He wrote it down. Vayishlach sefarim al kol hayudim, and he sent copies of this book to all the Jews. B'chol medinot hamelech, throughout the empire. And what did he want them to do? What did he tell them, instruct them to do? L'kayem aleihem liyot osim et yom 14 chodesh adar ve et yom 15 b'chol shana v'shana. He told them that they must celebrate the 2 days of Purim, the 14th and the 15th, depending on where one lives and what kind of town. That was, and to make these special days, and you'll see in the fourth line, l'kayem la'asototam yemei mishteh v'simcha u'mishloach manot, etc. To make these special days of feasting and celebration and giving presents. And it goes on to say, "V'kibel hayudim," and the Jews accepted this idea. It doesn't say that they accepted immediately, and from what we're about to see, it certainly was not immediately, but they did accept it eventually. That's the first paragraph. The second paragraph, these are psukim taken from the end of the Megillah, Perek Teth, towards the end. Vatichtov Esther, this is the second paragraph. Vatichtov Esther Amalka Vat Avihail, Mordechai Yehudi. Here, it's not just Mordechai writing, it's Mordechai and Esther together. Mordechai Yehudi, they wrote together what? Et Kol Tokef, which we'll see in a moment what that means. Lekayem et Igeret HaPurim Hazoth Hashenith. They wrote a second time. And here it was not just Mordechai, it was also Esther. And Rashi says, Hashenith, L'shana Hasheniyah Hazru V'sharhu Sefarim Sheyasu Purim. Why would a person send a year later the same letter, the same suggestion or demand or instruction that they sent a year before? Because it didn't go down so well the first year. Not everyone liked the idea, not everyone was impressed or willing to accept this notion. It didn't catch on. Not so quickly. So they did it again the next year, says Rashi. Another question we could ask ourselves, and we should ask ourselves, is why was it sufficient the first time for Mordechai to write by himself? And now we see that Esther has to write with him, to help him out, as it were. Why does Mordechai need her helping hand? Here, Ibn Ezra comes to our assistance. But before I go on to the Ibn Ezra, I'll just continue reading these psukim for a moment. It says that Esther and Mordechai, as we said, wrote a second time, and it says Et Kol Tokef, in other words, with using all force and authority. Where am I? Yeah. The second paragraph, first line. Number 2. Second paragraph, number 2. Lekayem et igeret ha-Purim hazot hashenith, vayishlach sefarim el kol hayudim, and they sent again books and copies to all the Jews in all parts of the empire. Lekayem et yemei Purim ha'ele bizmanehem, etc., etc. And then it goes on to say, Ka'asher kiyam alehem Mordechai Yehudi wa Esther Malka. It stresses the role of Esther Malka. You see that her role is being stressed. V'chasher kimu al nafsham. And it goes on to say, if in case you hadn't understood till now, it says it again, the last sentence, last pasuk. Uma'amar Esther. It was the words of, or the letter of Esther. Kiyam divrei Purim ha'ele v'nichtav b'sefer. It was the words of Esther. It was the fact that Esther went along with Mordechai and wrote a letter with her own seal on it. That is what tilted the scales. That's what tipped the scales. That's how it says here explicitly. Umamar Esther kiyam divrei Purim ha'ele. Now, what does all this mean? If you look at the Perush of Rabbi Avraham ibn Ezra, the bottom of the page, same page at the bottom, he writes as follows: Vayichtov Mordechai. This is the first paragraph. The first time, levado, by himself. Lekayem b'shana haba'ah. That next year, But when did he write this? He must have written this after the events of Purim. He couldn't have, whilst the fighting was going on, organized the writing and the sending, and it would arrive in time on the same day. That wasn't possible. He obviously did it immediately after Purim, so that next year they would celebrate Purim. This is the first time that he wrote, and he did it alone. His intention was to tell them, celebrate Purim every year. But that apparently was not enough. It says in the second paragraph that we read, there was now Esther and Mordechai together who wrote, Et kol tokef. What does Ibn Ezra say? Kumo hozek. The word tokef means chozek. In other words, with the full force of their authority as rulers of the empire. As it says, in other words, if one side is stronger. In other words, Ibn Ezra stresses, now it's not just Mordechai, it's Esther and Mordechai. And why is this important? In the second paragraph, at the end of the second line, it says, Divrei Shalom ve'emeth. You see that? This is what Ibn Ezra refers to. He says, V'ta'am emet shehem hayavim lishmor Purim kasher kiblu al nafsham. They instructed them in the second letter to accept Purim and to celebrate it. And he goes on to say, the proof that this is the correct understanding is what it says later. Umamar Esther kiyam divrei Purim. Hine, says Ibn Ezra, lo nitkayem al yedei Mordechai levado ad shekatava Esther. The fact that Purim became part of the Jewish people's calendar, that it was accepted by the Jewish people, was because Esther joined Mordechai in this effort, in this idea. Here also we can hear, again we sort of read a little bit between the lines, but not very much, because the Pasuk in the Megillah actually says, Umamar Esther, it was Esther's doing that made it happen in the end. We understand from all this that there was a lot of opposition to what Mordechai and Esther were doing. And when it was just Mordechai, apparently it didn't really take off. And it was only with Esther's help and with her authority as queen that it was eventually accepted. And we hear all of this and read this more explicitly in the Talmud Yerushalmi, which is on the next page, on the reverse side of the page. Number 3. Talmud Yerushalmi, Masechet Megillah, Perek Aleph, Halacha Hey. Rabbi Yirmiyah b'Shem Rabbi Shmuel bar Rav Yitzhak. Me'asu Mordechai wa Esther. What did the two of them, Mordechai and Esther, do? And you will note the Yerushalmi stresses the two of them, Mordechai and Esther. Kathavu igeret, they wrote a letter, V'shalhu l'Rabothenu, and they sent it to the Chachamim. Again, apparently the Chachamim in Eretz Yisrael. Sheken omeru lahem, this is what they said, Mekabalim atem alechem shnei yamim halalu b'chol shana. Are you willing to accept this concept of celebrating Purim for 2 days, Yudalad and Tedvav, every year? Why would they write such a letter? Because they knew that not everyone was willing to was really on board and willing to accept the idea. So they had to write and cajole them and try and force them to accept, at least those who were opposed. What did they answer? Amru lahem lo dayenu hasaroth haba'oth alenu ela shatem rosin losif alenu od sarathot shel Haman. This is exactly the same response that we saw in the Bavli in different words. In the Bavli the wording was Kina ath me'ored alenu leven ha'umot. You're going to cause us trouble with the goyim. Here the answer is, don't we have enough tzoros? Don't we have enough trouble without adding this new thing of Purim? No, another reason for the goyim to hate us and be anti-Semitic and work and by way of machinations and all kinds of underhanded plots, etc. They're going to try and harm us again, as Haman tried to do. So this just confirms what it says in the Yerushalmi, confirms what we saw in the Bavli. But now we see something more in the Yerushalmi. The Yerushalmi here is much more explicit and perhaps more, I think, more historically accurate and precise, giving over painting the picture of what happened at that time, which is not unusual. Very often this is the case when it comes to historical descriptions of what took place with regards to certain events, such as Purim. We find generally that Talmud Yerushalmi is more expansive, more detailed, and more precise. So it says here, so when they got the first response, which was not very positive, they wrote again. as we saw in the Megillah. It says they wrote a second time. That is what it says. This refers to the second letter. But what was written in the second letter? Archim is like the word archive. In other words, it's written in the history books, it's in the official archives. You can't hide it, everyone knows it. So, and again, this is the same response, the same discussion that we saw in the Bavli. They said, you're going to cause us trouble with the Goyim. The response was, it's everyone knows we can't cause trouble, it's already out there. Then it goes on to say, and it quotes the pasuk to prove that everyone knows about it. In other words, it's written in the books, everyone knows, the whole empire knows what happened. You can't hide, you can't keep this under wraps. But now it goes on to say the most important, the most revealing statement about what was really going on here. What were the points of view, what were the hashkafot olam that were in play here? Why were the Chachamim who were opposed, and apparently Chachamim who were for this idea of Mordechai and Esther of instituting Purim? Rabbi Ishmael bar Nachman b'shem Rabbi Yonathan. Shemonim v'hamisha zekenim umehem shelosha v'chama nevi'im. There were 85 Chachamim, great Chachamim, and 30, third paragraph, second page. Shemonim v'hamisha zekenim umehem sheloshim v'chama nevi'im. 85 Chachamim, amongst, and of that number, 30 were on the level of Nevi'im. This is apparently reference again to Anshe Knesset Agdola or something along those lines. Hayu mista'arim ala davar hazeh. They were grappling with this issue and they were having trouble with it. What was their trouble? What was the problem? Amaru. Kathib, it says in the Pasuk, at the end of Sefer Vayikra, it says, Kathib ele hamiswoth asher siwa Adonai et Moshe b'nei Yisrael b'har Sinai. This is the Pasuk. This Pasuk came down to the Chachamim by way of tradition with a drasha, a well-known, very ancient drasha. What is this drasha? Elu hamiswoth shenistavinu mipi Moshe. These are the miswoth that Moshe commanded us and gave over to us. Kach amar lanu. This is what he said to us. This is what Moshe said to us. En navi aher atid lahadesh lachem davar me'ata. No other prophet will come after me to change or add to my Torah, to add something new to the Torah. What I've given you, that's the Torah, and that's it. This is one of the bases for what the Rambam writes in his 13 principles or articles of the Jewish faith, of what a Jew is supposed to believe, that the Torah is not up for change or debate, it's immutable. So here we have this position. Ele ha-miswoth, these are the miswoth that Moshe commanded us, and we were taught always, from time immemorial, that there will not be new changes and new ideas, newfangled ideas, a new chag. You want to introduce a new chag. Where do we ever heard of a new chag? You have to understand. Till this time, there was no such thing in Yahadut. There was no Purim, there was no Chanukah, there was very few things that were Darabanan. So the whole concept of introducing such a new idea and a new practice into the Jewish world was a big chidush. It was a very new and radical concept. So they said, you want to introduce this new idea? We were told that you're not supposed to introduce new ideas. The Torah is as it is, and that's fine, as it is. You don't need to add anything to it. And you want to come along and add something to it? That was the claim. So we hear the claim. We hear the position. The position is an essential ideological position. It's not just the claim that we heard before, that you're going to cause us trouble with the Goyim, and there'll be more anti-Semitism or things of that nature, which is also, again, there was some basis for those kinds of fears and concerns as well. But those apparently were the initial responses in order to try and deflect Mordechai and Esther. But the real issue we hear here, and we don't hear this in the Talmud Bavli very clearly, or not, maybe not at all, you could say. It's when you read it in the Yerushalmi, then you understand this is what was also going on in the background in the Bavli. But only when you read the Yerushalmi do you understand what was really going on. The real issue was this whole idea about chadshanut, of introducing new ideas, of being able and willing and interested in making changes, introducing new things into the Jewish world, into Jewish practice, into halakha. This was the issue. What does the Yerushalmi say? The last paragraph on number 3. Lo zazu misham, noseim v'nothanim b'davar. The Chachamim debated this issue for a long time. Ad shehe'ir HaKadosh Baruch Hu et eineihem, literally, until Hashem opened their eyes. U'masau afa kathuv b'Torah u'v'nevi'im u'v'ketuvim. In other words, they were able to find a pasuk, and this is how Torah debate worked in those times. In those days, a person didn't make any statement of Torah, of halakha, without bringing a pasuk and basing what he's saying in some way on the pasuk. Even if it's a somewhat far-fetched drasha, you had to connect it to a pasuk. This was the tradition, this was the way things were done. What did they find? Which pasuk did they find? Pasuk says, Again, this is the pasuk at the end of Parashat Beshalach, when Hashem says to Moshe, after Yoshua fights and defeats Amalek, Hashem says to Moshe, Kethov Zov Zikaron Basefer. This refers to Amalek, to wipe out Amalek. What is the drasha? Zoth Torah, this refers to the Torah. Kamo Dethema Uzoth HaTorah Shosa Moshe Lefnei Bnei Israel. Zikaron Elu Nevi'im, this refers to Nevi'im, the word Zikaron. We have here 4 words. Zoth, Kethov Zoth Zikaron Basefer. The question is, why do you have to have all these words? You could have said Kethov Zikaron, or Kethov Basefer, or Kethov Zoth. But to say Kethov Zoth Zikaron Basefer sounds a little bit superfluous, as if it's trying to stress something. Zikaron, this refers to Nevi'im, they therefore said. As it says, Az nidbaru yirei Adonai, ish al ra'ehu, yakshev Adonai wa yishma, wa yukatev sefer Zikaron. It says, this is a pasuk in the Navi, talks about a Zikaron, nefanav yirei Adonai, ulehol shaveh shemo. Basefer, and when it says the word Sefer, this refers to the Ketuvim, the additional books of the Tanakh, the later books of the Tanakh. Umamar, as it says, Mamar Esther, Kiyam Divrei Purim Hale, V'nichtav Basefer. In other words, initially, many Chachamim opposed the idea of introducing a book to the Tanakh, of introducing a new Chag. The whole concept was strange and foreign and difficult for them to accept. Apparently, there were those who didn't think so, but it seems that initially they were in the minority. But after much debate, and probably, I imagine, a number of years, maybe even many years, perhaps as many as tens of years, we don't know for a fact, but certainly a few years must have passed until all this discussion and digesting the ideas and getting used to it and seeing that it's not so terrible after all, doesn't lead to Judaism falling apart. We hear this today also about different things, a certain idea or a certain suggestion, whatever it might be. If you do this, some people say, Judaism will come to an end. All the yeshiva bochas will stop keeping Shabbat, or all sorts of things. But it's not always so. Very often these fears are exaggerated, and the whole situation perhaps is not seen correctly, is not interpreted correctly. Over time, apparently, more and more Chachamim came to agree with the position of Mordechai and Esther, and you have to understand from all that we're reading here that Mordechai and Esther were, in the eyes of the more extreme, the more conservative of the Chachamim, they were like reform rabbis. These were people with these newfangled ideas, and they want to make changes to Yadut, ma pitom. Why would we accept such a thing? And who's Mordechai to say such a thing? And who's Esther? Bichlal. She may be a queen, but doesn't make her in charge of Yiddishkeit now. Over time, more and more Chachamim began to adopt this position, and eventually they became the majority. And that's apparently how Purim became part of our calendar. When more and more Chachamim, a certain critical mass of Chachamim and their students, their followers accepted the idea, it became the accepted thing. As it says in Masechet Sofarim, Ena lacha nikba'at ad shikava minhag. In other words, sometimes the halacha is decided by what people do. When? Not in all things, as some people think, that whatever the discussion is, just check what people are doing. If they say this is what you do, then they're correct. No, that's not what it says. It says in the Talmud Yerushalmi, you go outside, puk hazeh ma'amad deva, go and see what people do, what their practice is halachically. When do you say this? When the halacha is rofefet biyadecha. In other words, when you're not sure how the halacha should be laid down. In other words, when you have two opinions, And you can't really decide the issue on the basis of masao matan, of debate and ra'ayot. There are no clear ra'ayot for one side more than the other side. Each side has a certain argument and makes some sense. Then sometimes it makes sense to go out and see what people are doing, how they, in actual fact, how they live this thing. What do they do in the real world? If you see that all the Jews are going according to this opinion, then that itself becomes the new halakha, because there's no other way to decide this issue. So the Jewish people decided, but that's on this kind of issue when the thing is unclear. So over time, the concept of Purim, of a new Megillah as part of the Tanakh, of introducing a new Chag into Judaism, these ideas became more mainstream, and eventually they became accepted. In source number 4, from the Talmud Bavli, Megillah Daf Tet Zayin, we see that even after the position of Mordechai and Esther was accepted, it's not true, it would be naive to think that all the Chachamim and all the Jews overnight changed their mind and accepted this new position. It's not so. We see here, it says in the Pasuk, at the end of the Megillah, Ki Mordechai Yehudi, Mishneh LaMelech Ahashverosh, V'gadol LaYehudim, V'rasui L'rov Ehau. The simple meaning of the words Rasui L'rov Ehau, that Mordechai was liked and supported by Rov Ehau, does not mean what we usually understand it to mean today by the word Rov. Today the word Rov means a majority. And that's also what Chazal mean when they say Rov. But in the Tanakh, when you say Rov Ehau, it means by a huge number of his brethren. But that also implies a majority. But it says that a huge number of the people supported him. For this reason, the drasha is made in the Gemara there. L'rov Ehau v'lo l'chol Ehau. In other words, it could have said in the pasuk, he was rasui l'chol Ehau. He was liked and accepted and honored by all of his brethren. Or it could have just said rasui l'Ehau. But it says l'rov Ehau, which implies that there were some who weren't so crazy about him. They thought this guy's a little bit problematic. We're not comfortable with this Mordechai. Melamed shepershu mimenu miksat Sanhedrin. In other words, some of the Chachamim pershu mimenu. What does that mean, pershu mimenu? They distanced themselves from him. They
broke away from him.
Well, we don't know exactly in which fashion they could break away exactly, but they distanced themselves from him. They didn't want to talk to him too much. They wanted to keep their distance, keep away. They sort of put him in a kind of cherem or semi-cherem, something like that. Again, you can hear echoes of what we hear here, you can hear today as well. A certain rabbi today says something which other rabbis don't like, and you very often hear that so-and-so said he should be in cherem, or he's an apikoros, or what have you. You can imagine you can be quite certain, I think, there were people saying at the time, maybe even some chachamim, about Mordechai, that he's an apikoros, or a chatzi, or a safek apikoros. This guy is not entirely kosher. That's what we're reading here. That's what we read here. The next statement is a little bit more unusual. It says that Rav Yosef, the Chacham Bavli Rav Yosef, says, Gadol Tamud Torah yoter min hasarat nefashot. The study of Torah is greater than the saving of lives, which is a difficult thing to understand, literally, because we know it's not true. A person can't say, if he sees that someone's being attacked and he can save him, he can't say, well, I'm busy reading the Tosafot here, so I'm sorry, it doesn't interest me. A person can't say that. If he says so, he's over on the miswaf lo ta'aseh lo ta'amol adam re'echa. So it can't be taken literally. But Rav Yosef is trying to say that the most important thing is learning of Torah, which is a very Talmud Bavli type statement to make, and is based on the fact that in one pasuk Mordechai is mentioned, assuming that's the same Mordechai, which is the assumption here. In one pasuk, a Mordechai is mentioned after 4 people, another pasuk is mentioned after 5 people. So the idea is that he was demoted. He became less important in the eyes of many of the people, many of the Chachamim, because he, as Rashi says, shepershu mimenu lefi shebatal midivrei Torah v'nichnas l'srara. Rashi says it's because he learned less Torah and got more involved in governance, in becoming he was a minister, and he was the viceroy, he was the Mishneh LaMelech, a very important position, he was in government, so he was busy doing all sorts of things, but not studying Torah as much as he used to. That's what Rashi says. And here, B'mehilat Kevodo Shel Rabbeinu Hagadol Rashi Zal, I wish to differ. I don't think that that's the pshat. I don't think that's what is intended by the Gemara when it says that some of the Sanhedrin, some of the Chachamim wish to distance themselves from Mordechai. It wasn't because he was learning less Torah than he had been doing a few years earlier. Before he was learning 3 daf a day, and now he was learning 2 daf a day, so that's why they decided this guy is not for us. I don't think that's what it's about at all. It's talking about what we just read a moment ago in the Talmud Bavli and Yerushalmi. The very fact that this Mordechai wants to introduce these new ideas into Yahadut, that's what bothered them. They were concerned about this whole approach in Judaism. They thought it was very dangerous. And based on all the sources that we read, that's I think a very reasonable suggestion. That's a very reasonable perush of what is meant here. And just to prove the point that when it says that Pirshu Imenu Sanhedrin, it doesn't mean that he's not the same Mordechai as before because he's studying less Torah a little bit than before. If you see someone, and you know that, as I said, you know that he used to learn 3 daf of Gemara a day, and now you know that because he's more into business today, he spends more time in his business affairs, so he only manages to learn 2 daf a day, or 1 daf. He goes to daf yomi every day, and that's all he manages to do. For that reason, you would not want to speak to him. For that reason, you would tell your Talmidim, keep away from that Mordechai. He's a problem. That doesn't make sense. That doesn't wash. Where do we see a similar expression? Pirshu Menu Sanhedrin. Number 5, the last source, referring to David HaMelech. Amarav Yudah Amarav. Shisha Hodashim Nistara David. This is in Sanhedrin. Kof Kov Zayin. Shisha Hodashim Nistara David Nistaraka Imenu Shechina Ufershu Menu Sanhedrin. This refers to David HaMelech, who, as we know, sinned with Bathsheba, and there's no argument about that, despite a certain statement in the Talmud Bavli, but nevertheless, there's another statement in the same Talmud Bavli which says the opposite, and the pshat of the pasuk remains the pshat of the pasuk. David HaMelech sinned, and even though he did tshuva, some of the Sanhedrin wanted to keep their distance from David HaMelech. That's exactly what it says here. Because of David HaMelech, he nistara as punishment for his sin, and they took this as a sign they should stay away from him. Again, you see that the expression Pirshu Imenu Sanhedrin means that you take issue with what this person did or said, not the fact that he's learning fewer daf Gemara per day than he used to. That's not a reason to take such a position against the person. At most you can say, no, it's a chaval, he was a bigger lamdan 10 years ago, and now he's less of a lamdan, malasot. That's not a reason to either hate a person or to distance yourself from such a person. When it says Pirshu Menu Sanhedrin, it means to say they were very bothered by what he said or what he did. In the case of David HaMelech, we know why they were bothered. In the case of Mordechai, we also know why they were bothered. They were bothered because of the reasons we saw, because Ele HaMisvot, this is what Moshe Rabbeinu gave us, and you want to add to it. So let us sum up what we've seen here this evening. Mordechai and Esther were the earliest examples that we have on record, at least, I think, of people who understood that the Torah, even though it's true that the Torah was given to us by Moshe Rabbeinu, and it's not something that can be wantonly changed or re-edited or redacted and do with it as you please. That's certainly not true. Nevertheless, it's also not possible that the Torah is frozen in time and place and cannot change in any way, that nothing can be developed, nothing can be introduced, there can be no vision and no willingness to deal with a new reality, to seize a new opportunity, in this case, to thank Hashem and to tell all the future generations of Am Yisrael of what happened and how we have to understand that this is a result of Hashem's hashgaha. That is the whole story of Purim, after all. What is the story of Purim? It's about the fact that Hashem is always working behind the scenes. In the whole Megillah, we know there's not one mention of Shem Hashem. Why not? Because the principle of Purim is that even when you don't see Hashem in action, He's working behind the scenes. He's arranging things. this person heard about this attempted assassination against Ahasuerus. He told so-and-so, it was written down in the records. Another time, another event, Ahasuerus couldn't sleep, they read the records, he asked about who said this, Mordechai told, we know the story, we know how it played out. It's all a series of apparent coincidences, of happenstances. This happened, A led to B, which led to C, which led to D. That's the whole story of the Megillah. But if you look at the real world, you look at life, you see that's how the world works. That one thing leads to another, apparently without connection, but the fact is you can follow the thread, you can see the connection, and you can connect the dots and see that Hashem is organizing events in a certain way. And in the case, sometimes perhaps we imagine a connection which doesn't exist. I'm not saying one can't convince oneself of something which is not there. One can, especially if one wants to. One can convince oneself of almost anything if one wants to. But I'm not saying you should. But you don't always have to be convinced that you know exactly what Hashem's up to. None of us have received direct gilui min hashamayim that this is what Hashem is doing today or yesterday or tomorrow. But in the case of Purim, it's so clear. The events were so unusual. That's why it's referred to as a nes, by the way. The word nes, which we understand usually to mean a miracle, in the case of Purim, is a strange word to use, even though the Gemara Masechet Arachin in the Talmud Bavli talks about the nes of Purim, and we should all ask ourselves, what is the Gemara talking about? What nes? What nes was there? There was nothing supernatural about Purim. It was all according to the laws of nature and the normal workings of the world and the political realm, etc. No miracle at all. The word nes in Hebrew does not just mean a miracle in the supernatural sense. It also means a very unusual, unique type of event which sticks out. The word nes actually means a banner. What is a banner? A banner is something that's held high above and stands out above everything else so people can see it, right? So it stands out, it's special. In the same way, an unusual event like Purim, where so many different things fall into place in such a precise fashion to lead to a very specific result, that is a nes, that is an unusual, something beyond the law of the laws of chance. This is something that has to be the hand of Hashem. And that is what Purim is all about. And Mordechai and Esther wanted this understanding that Hashem runs the world not only by direct intervention, like in Yetziat Mitzrayim, by miracles which we can all see, but also Hashem runs the world. In fact, most of the time Hashem doesn't run the world like Yetziat Mitzrayim. Most of the time Hashem runs the world like Purim. And that's why the statement of Chazal, which the Rambam brings the end of Yichot Megillah, that all the Chagim will be batil, but Purim will not be batil. Because the idea, the knowledge, and the awareness that Hashem runs the world without us being aware of it is essential to the Jewish people, that we be aware of this and understand this and internalize this for all time. That's why Purim will never be batil, will never be cease to be celebrated. So Mordechai and Esther were aware of these ideas and the impact and the importance and the significance of Purim, and they knew that this had to become part of the Jewish psyche, part of the Jewish calendar, part of halachic practice. Some Chachamim were opposed, others were for. A debate ensued, and eventually the Chachamim that took the side of Mordechai and Esther were victorious. They became the majority in the mainstream. And today, we are all followers of Mordechai and Esther, because we all celebrate Purim. If we were not followers of Mordechai and Esther, then we would continue on Yudared and Tevav B'Adar Bet, or B'Adar in a regular year, as if nothing happened. And throughout history, we see these two positions, the more conservative, rigid approach of no change, and the more innovative and daring approach, where that certain things can and must be changed where necessary, according to a certain Torah logic that has to be applied. We see this later, shall we say, in the time of Bet Shammai and Bet Hillel. If you look at the different discussions between Bet Shammai and Bet Hillel, you often see that Bet Shammai are adopting or continuing the old traditional position, and no one's doubting that that was not the case. And Hillel also knew that that was the position, but he also knew that sometimes things had to change, or you could look at it a different way. In other words, the position or the view, the halachic view that had been accepted till now is not necessarily the only view. And therefore it's not a surprise, and it's not a coincidence, that when there was a need to do something so that poor people could receive a loan during the Shemitah year from people who had the money to give them such a loan, because and people were worried about giving such a loan because they knew at the end of the year they wouldn't get the money back. The Shmitat Ksafim, at the end of the Shemitah year, debts are forgiven and you can't demand the money back from the person. So the person asks you for a loan and you think he won't pay you back before the end of the Shemitah year, you may not want to give him that loan. And that's exactly what happened. And this is a big problem for people who need that loan very desperately. It shouldn't surprise us that it was Hillel HaZaken and not Shammai HaZaken who introduced the Pruzbul. Because Pruzbul is a big chidush. It's a very, very big chidush. But it was something that had to happen. It was something that was necessary, and Hillel was willing to make that move. And one can be certain that Shammai HaZaken and his followers didn't like the idea. It doesn't say this explicitly, but I think it's absolutely certain that they didn't like the idea. And the same can be seen amongst the Rishonim. We have more conservative and less conservative approaches, and one can see it today as well. In the present day, in the Jewish world, the Torah world, you have the more arch-conservative approach, which doesn't want to countenance anything new or relate to anything new, and prefers to pretend that nothing happened. For example, do you relate to the fact that there is a Jewish state today, and how do you relate to it? What do you do on Yom Ha'atzmaut? Do you do anything? Do you do nothing? You carry on as usual, as if as our forefathers did 100 years ago, before there was such an event, such a reality. We know that there are different positions about this. We know the names that are usually attached to these different hashkafot, and you should understand, and it's important that we know that this is nothing new. This has always been the case, and we are Baruch Hashem Talmidim of Mordechai and Esther, and we understand that together with being traditional, in other words, we are part of a tradition which maintains that which was, we are also always on the move and willing and able to deal with new realities and new ideas as the times and the necessity requires us to do. This is the way of Mordechai and Esther, this is the way of Beth Hillel, and we know that Beth Hillel became the mainstream view in the halachic world, in the Jewish world, and this is also the way of many, not all, but many Rabbanim today as well. And therefore a person does not have to feel that we belong to the camp of people who are more mekel or not so serious about Torah. It's not a question of being serious about Torah. It's a question of seeing the big picture and not being locked into a certain mindset and not being willing to pull up your head outside the turret of the tank and look around and see what's going on. That is one of the important messages of Purim. Kol Tov Lach.